And they help me with getting the focus right for strategic assessment. That requires flexibility. This is, again, engaging.
How can we make environmental impact assessment better? This is the main driving question of a series of online interviews I'm doing with some of the world's leading EIA specialists. Today I have the privilege to talk to Maria Partidário about this very simple but challenging question. However, I broke down this question into a set of 5 sub-questions targeting the application of impact assessment to decision-making at the most strategic levels. Strategic Environmental Assessment, also known as SEA, is the name we give to impact assessments of policies, plans, and programs. Although less frequent than project-level EIAs, strategic environmental assessments are becoming increasingly important in both developed and developing countries. Maria Partidário is Associate Professor at the University of Lisbon, Portugal. Maria is the former president of the International Association for Impact Assessment, from which she received in 2015 the Lifetime Achievement Award. She has published widely on impact assessment, and her publications on SEAs have long been inspiring both practice and theory globally. Maria is right now in Canada to attend a workshop, and I could reach her at her hotel in Ottawa. I've been asking these 5 questions to EIA specialists, and I have 5 questions for you today. And the first question I have is, what should be the main objectives of strategic environmental assessments?
Okay, well, the main objective of strategic environmental assessment should be to help to provide direction about future developments and future trajectories for sustainability. Whether that would be within policies or plans or programs or projects, major projects, or even whether we're dealing with a major complex problem that will be strategic from the point of view of future development, SEA could apply exactly to help figure out, to help identify the most suitable options that would enable to deliver sustainability in the long term.
All right. Maria, I'm curious about the methodology of SEAs. How different it is or should be from a methodological standpoint, SEAs compared to project-level EIAs?
I believe that it should be different, very different, actually. Not because the EIA doesn't work well. It does. It's a very good, strong, solid instrument. But it applies where the evidence, it's not in front of our eyes, but it's almost, which means that when we're doing an assessment of a project, even if the project is still not designed, of course it should not be built, but it's not been designed yet. Usually it's a typical kind of project which you might have seen in other places, in the same country, the same region, but would be a design that would be expected. And of course, the development of a project in each different location will determine the need to do a specific assessment as a function of that location. But the project itself contains elements that can be expected. Now, when we're dealing with policies and with plans, this situation doesn't happen. In policies or in plans, you can shift completely the orientation from the time that the plan was approved until its actual implementation. It's a question of priorities. It's a question of political priorities, in fact. It's also a question of changing contexts. And changing context, as we know nowadays, it's a huge thing because we cannot control these big, major global problems and challenges that we need to face. And that requires flexibility and requires that both planning, policies, and strategic assessment be flexible enough to be able to change course when it's necessary.
And do you think that we have been learning to be flexible? Are we getting any better in strategic environmental assessment, Maria?
It's hard to say. I don't think so. On the other hand, there are signs that people are understanding that strategic environmental assessment cannot just be a big EIA and needs to be something more than just the assessment of effects of what is being put on proposals of planning or programs or policies. The problem, Alberto, is that because people have different understandings of SCA, they will consider that there's a lot of good examples if the SCA delivers a report, if there was some public consultation, and if those that receive the report find that it is useful.
Do you use the IAIA checklist to see if it...
Yeah. You know, one day I asked someone, why is that because of an SCA, a previous SCA some years ago, and asked, why do you think the SCA would, the person was telling me, oh yeah, the SCA was very good, was very useful. And I asked, why? Why was it useful? And she said, well, because it delivered recommendations and a monitoring program, and which we could use. You see, so the reasons why people find examples good, it's not because the whole thing is good, but it's because there are elements in that process that are helpful to those that receive it.
Talking about these elements, if there's one element that always comes to mind when we talk about what to expect in good SCAs, would be public participation, or as they call it, the meaningful public participation. How can we meaningfully engage people in SCAs, Maria?
You know, we need to, first of all, identify the key stakeholders, the key actors in the process. And we need to do that work carefully so that we don't leave out people that would be relevant, and we don't engage a lot of people. Because, you know, there's no way that within strategic assessment you can work with too many people. That doesn't work. But then you engage them in a number of different occasions, and I do engage them at least twice. One, to define the problem and identify the problem and identify what would be the critical aspects to be addressed from their point of view. And if I ensure that I have a good span of perspectives of the different stakeholders, then I am already working with a reasonable, good scope of issues that they bring up from their own perspective and from their own experience. And they help me with getting the focus right for strategic assessment. And then I engage them again, at least once more, with options and options assessment. And I ask them, okay, if this is where we want to get, if these are the problems that we have, what are the options? I mean, you may be thinking, or whoever is developing that plan or program or policy may be thinking about a particular trajectory or a particular proposal, a particular idea, you know, about how to deal with whatever, forest management or with housing development. So this is one way. And then, of course, if we have the opportunity, then we can engage them more, for example, to discuss the outcomes of the assessment, you know, after they have been contributing to the options. In order also to do monitoring. That's another thing I did once, which was after a SCA was completed and the plan, we then did the follow-up, what I call the continuing evaluation. And so we have been speaking to a number of actors and agencies and authorities and trying to understand to what extent the outcome of the SCA and the outcome of the plan had been at all useful. If we tried to look into key indicators, we tried to learn if the recommendations, which are normally more of a governance nature, if they were implemented, if they were useful. You see, so and this is again engaging the actors, the different actors.
And now finally, my last question. How should we design legislation and regulations to foster meaningful, effective strategic environmental assessments?
Actually, you could look at a recent legislation on SCA that was published in Panama. That was developed by or prepared by with the support of a colleague of mine from Chile. And I looked at that the other day, and it was the closest to what I would say would be a nice piece of legislation. And basically, it cannot be in the same lines of EIA for the same reasons that I mentioned before. It should not have a very fixed procedure. Even with EIA, we know that it's difficult sometimes because the decision processes in different sectors are different, and therefore they should be able to adjust EIA to their specific decision processes to become more effective. And with strategic assessment, it's even more, you know. And so having fixed procedures is not a good idea. But what you need in the legislation is to have the main pointers defined, namely, for example, one thing that I know it's being discussed in Canada. It was also discussed in Brazil at a certain point in time, which was what are the values that, you want to make sure that will be met, that will be observed, and that can almost act as screening criteria to decide if you're going to go ahead with SCA or with strategic assessment or not. For example, in Australia, they have what they call matters of environmental national interest. And they have a list of these matters, and they say if a certain initiative will affect these matters, then we should look into the strategic issues related to that initiative and see to what extent we could avoid affecting these matters. My only problem with that, like I've seen in Australia, is that the SCA ends up being limited to those matters of national interest. And then there's other aspects that would be important to also look at for specific cases. But because they're not matters of national interest, they may be forgotten. They may be overlooked, you see? Mm-hmm. But if you do it in a more generic way, like, climate change or poverty or cultural value, for example, here in Canada, indigenous traditions and cultural values, those things that that they are so horizontal, they are so relevant that they will matter at any time, then you're working on the safe side, because you make sure that this instrument will be useful to address those matters that care. And then I think the legislation should require for me, what are the main components of an SCA in a framework, which is get focused, don't try to cover everything, but just be selective about what is actually strategic. Identify your options or work towards finding the best sustainable option to be able to help with the development of the future development and what is priority for future development, and above all, monitor and ensure that the public is engaged. So public engagement and monitoring are the other two aspects that any legislation should make sure that there's provisions for that, and that this connects to a learning process and an ongoing process and in which SCA, that's the other thing, SCA should not be done for a plan or a program. SCA should be done to support strategic decision making.
I have to ask a follow-up question. Should our legislation have some specific triggers for SCA, or should SCA be still like a fully discretionary decision of governments?
I've been changing my opinion a lot on that matter. In the old days, I used to say that SCA should be voluntary. And I was absolutely convinced of that. Why? Because people or companies, organizations would want to do that because it would be better for them. And I trusted that this would happen with SCA. And I still believe that one day that may happen. However, there's a number of restrictions that are hampering, or conditions that are hampering, this vision that I have of SCA. There is an incredible lack of strategic thinking in development processes these days. You see? And people aim towards short-term results. Very difficult to get authorities, planners, entrepreneurs to have a long-term strategic thinking. And that is hampering the capacity of SCA to be seen as a strategic instrument.
All right. Maria, with that, I think we covered a lot, and I thank you so much. Acho que eu vou falar um pouco de português. Queria terminar então com um muito obrigado